You were just a fling, a fun distraction. I could never take someone like you seriously." He grabbed her wrist, leaned in close, and whispered those cruel words before walking away, leaving her 6 months pregnant with twins and no future. Or so he thought. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. We love seeing how far these stories travel. What do you think happens next? Does she break or does she rise? You won't believe how this abandoned young black woman turned betrayal into a billion-dollar empire and left the man who called her a burden speechless. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next powerful story, and comment below if this one got your heart racing. If you're ready for a tale of resilience, revenge, and the ultimate glow-up, stick around. This is one story you'll want to hear until the very last second. Penelope Carter stared at the small plastic stick in her trembling hand, the two pink lines glowing like neon under the harsh bathroom light. The silence of the cramped dorm bathroom pressed in around her, thick and suffocating, as if the walls themselves held their breath with her. She blinked once, twice, hoping that second line was a trick of the eye, maybe a reflection or a mistake. But it didn't vanish. Instead, it grew sharper, clearer, as if mocking her disbelief. Her knees weakened, and she sank onto the closed toilet lid, the cold of the porcelain grounding her in a reality she wasn't prepared for. Her heart thudded against her ribs, a dull drumbeat of panic, and though she tried to breathe deeply, the air felt too thin to reach her lungs. The knock on the shared suite door echoed faintly from the hallway, but Penelope didn't flinch. Her entire focus remained locked on the pregnancy test in her hand. She was 21, a black woman on a full-ride aerospace scholarship at Stanford, a rising star in a department dominated by men, and now she was pregnant. The weight of those two lines crushed every carefully laid plan, every sleepless night studying propulsion systems, every moment she'd fought to prove she belonged. Her lips moved soundlessly, as if even her voice had abandoned her in the moment. "No, no, no," she whispered eventually, but the truth had already sunk its claws into her. This wasn't a midterm she could redo, a code she could debug, or a lab experiment she could restart. This was real. This was irreversible. She stared down at her flat belly, her hands reflexively resting there, and the thought hit her like a freight train. What would Kieran say? She could already see the expression on his perfectly sculpted face, those cold blue eyes narrowing, that arrogant smirk curling at the corner of his lips. Kieran Whitmore, the heir to Whitmore Dynamics, had swept into her life like a storm, handsome, brilliant, and intoxicatingly confident. For a while she'd believed his attention was genuine, that his compliments weren't just sugar-coated manipulation, and that his world, though different, might have room for a girl from South Atlanta who had clawed her way into the Ivy League with nothing but talent and grit. They'd dated for over a year. He'd taken her to high society events, kissed her under chandeliers worth more than her family's entire home, and whispered promises into her skin that now echoed like lies. That evening, she cooked his favorite, pan-seared lamb with truffle risotto, burning through the last $42 in her checking account. She set the table with mismatched plates from the thrift store and lit the single taper candle they'd once laughed over. She wore the navy blue dress he said made her eyes look like stars, even curled her hair the way he liked. And then she waited, checking her phone every few minutes, watching the clock tick toward a moment she both feared and hoped for. At 7:52, his text came through. "Running late. Traffic sucks. Be there in 20. When Kieran finally walked in, smelling of expensive cologne and Manhattan Power, she smiled nervously and stepped forward, heart hammering. But the moment he saw the effort she'd made, the dinner, the dress, the candlelight, his eyes narrowed, not with affection, but suspicion. "What's all this?" he said, loosening his designer tie and tossing his keys on the counter. "You know I hate surprises." She reached for him gently, whispering, "I just wanted tonight to be special." He pulled back slightly, gaze sharp. "Are you wearing makeup? What's going on?" She hesitated, suddenly unsure how to break the news she'd rehearsed all day. He sat, poured himself a glass of red from the wine he brought last week, and frowned at the slightly overcooked lamb. "Let's just eat. I'm starving." The candle flickered between them as she pushed food around her plate, nausea rising not from morning sickness, but dread. Then she said it, quietly at first, then again, firmer. I'm pregnant, Kieran. We're... I'm pregnant with twins. His fork hit the plate like a gunshot. For a second, he didn't move, his face frozen, unreadable. And then, slowly, a cruel smile tugged at his lips. He leaned forward, voice low and deliberate. Twins? Are you sure they're mine? The words gutted her. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. He stood, circled the table, and bent down next to her, his cologne suddenly suffocating. You thought this would trap me, didn't you? He whispered, his breath hot and venomous. Let me be very clear, Penny. You were just a fling, a fun distraction. I could never take someone like you seriously. She stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. You said you loved me, she finally managed, barely above a whisper. He straightened, now looming over her, contempt written across every inch of his face. That's what you wanted to hear. You're smart, Penelope. Book smart. But don't confuse that with being smart in the real world. Girls like you don't end up with guys like me. My family expects me to marry someone who knows how to host charity galas, not clip coupons. This, he said, gesturing at the table, at her, at everything. This was never real. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. But the cold detachment in his tone made it far worse. He walked into the bedroom and returned moments later with a duffel bag. I already told my dad I was moving to New York to start overseeing the East Coast office. Guess I'm just leaving a little earlier. He tossed a small velvet box at her feet, the promise ring, the one she'd worn for over a year, believing it meant something. It landed with a soft clink, the diamond catching the candlelight as if mocking her. You're a burden to my future, he said with finality, and I don't carry dead weight. He left without looking back. The door clicked shut behind him, and just like that she was alone, pregnant, humiliated, and heartbroken. For a long moment, she sat frozen. The candle sputtered, its flame unsteady, and her tears finally fell, hot and unstoppable. But even as they streamed down her face, somewhere deep in her chest, something else sparked to life. Quiet, small, but burning. Not anger, not revenge. Something colder, something sharper. Something that whispered, "We'll show him." Penelope Carter didn't have the luxury of falling apart. After Kieran left, silence pressed into her apartment like a second skin. Cold, tight, suffocating, but she didn't scream or collapse or break anything. Instead, she sat at the dining table where the untouched lamb had gone cold, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her mind already spinning. Every emotion, grief, rage, betrayal, was shoved into a box she didn't have time to open. She was pregnant with twins, and no one was coming to save her. Not her estranged parents back in Georgia, not the university's overworked counseling center, and not the man who had called her a burden. If she wanted her children to have a chance in this world, she would have to be brutal with herself and brilliant with her time. By midnight, the apartment was dark except for the glow of her laptop. On the screen, an Excel spreadsheet blinked back at her like a lifeline. She labeled it Survival Blueprint. One tab for finances, one for work shifts, one for doctor appointments, and one for projected GPA targets. She calculated every cent in her checking account, $183.49, and mapped out exactly how long she could last on instant noodles, boiled eggs, and bulk rice from the international market 2 blocks away. Rent was due in 2 weeks, and she would be $240 short unless she picked up another shift. She already worked as a library aide in the early mornings and closed down a 24-hour diner on weekends, but maybe she could squeeze in afternoon transcription work from her laptop. Sleep would be optional, efficiency would be mandatory. The next morning, she walked into Stanford's financial aid office with a steel spine and a forced smile. When the woman behind the desk asked if everything was okay, Penelope lied. Just exploring scholarship extensions. What she meant was, I'm going to bring 2 humans into this world while finishing a degree designed to break people twice as privilege. She secured an emergency grant, not much, but enough to keep her in housing for another month. Then she returned to her dorm and sold the last of her jewelry, 2 pairs of earrings and a gold chain from her grandmother, for grocery money. She dropped her physics elective, replaced it with an independent study, and rewrote her class schedule to revolve around her body's new limits. If the twins kicked too hard at night, she'd study in the morning. If she puked all day, she'd code from bed at 2 a.m. There was no version of this where she got to fall apart. Days turned into weeks, and Penelope became a master of managing the unmanageable. She no longer attended student mixers or research socials. She traded in group projects for solo problem sets and lab access during the quietest hours. Her body changed fast, faster than she was ready for. And the silence of watching herself grow alone was sometimes louder than Kieran's words had ever been. But every time she caught her reflection and saw the curve of her belly, she would press a hand against it and whisper, not to herself but to them, "We're going to make it, no matter what." The university gym became her refuge, not for fitness, but for the locker rooms, private showers, and the occasional stolen nap in the sauna when no one was looking. She memorized the best vending machines for late-night calories and learned how to time her grocery store visits right when markdown stickers went up. Her fingers grew calloused from typing resumes for classmates in exchange for cash. She edited dissertations for grad students, coded apps for engineering clubs, and even wrote love letters for awkward freshmen who didn't know how to talk to girls. Pride became a luxury she couldn't afford, but survival, that was non-negotiable. One rainy afternoon, during a particularly long transcription shift, Penelope felt a sharp cramp. Panic flared briefly, but she forced herself to breathe through it and sipped warm water like the nurse had suggested. She knew stress could trigger complications, but stress had become her default setting. She Googled every risk associated with twin pregnancies, memorized every symptom to watch out for, and tracked her body like a scientist charting a volatile chemical. Her notebooks were no longer just filled with propulsion equations and orbital mechanics. They held hand-drawn meal plans, growth charts, and affirmations scribbled in the margins. Strong, brilliant, unbreakable. When her professors noticed her drifting off during lectures or taking frequent bathroom breaks, they never said anything, but a few of them started slipping her lecture notes or asking if she needed deadline extensions. She always said no, not because she wanted to be a martyr, but because she knew that leniency now might mean lowered expectations later. She couldn't afford to be seen as the pregnant girl. She had to be the best, even while carrying twice the weight. The worst moments weren't the exhaustion or the hunger or even the nausea that never seemed to leave. The worst were the moments when she'd see other students laughing under the campus archways, sprawled on the quad with coffees and futures unburdened by betrayal. Sometimes she envied them, not their freedom, but their ignorance. They didn't have to know what it felt like to be discarded like trash by someone who once claimed to love you. They didn't have to fight through 3 a.m. contractions while writing a fluid dynamics paper due in 6 hours. Still, she didn't allow herself to hate them, just like she didn't allow herself to hate Kieran. Not because he didn't deserve it, but because hating him meant giving him space in her mind. And that space, like her time, was now fully reserved for 2 things: her education and her son's. Every dollar earned, every hour studied, every meal skipped, it all built toward a future he had no right to be part of. And late at night, when sleep finally came for a few precious minutes, Penelope dreamed not of revenge, but of peace. A quiet home, 2 laughing boys running through a sunlit hallway, a name on a laboratory door that read, Dr. Penelope Carter. A world where no one ever again told her she was a burden. Penelope Carter hadn't felt true stillness in weeks. But that morning, as she lay in a hospital bed with wires monitoring 2 tiny heartbeats, time finally slowed. Her body, worn down by sleepless nights and endless shifts, had rebelled. Her legs buckled in the physics building, and she collapsed in front of a vending machine, stomach contracting in sharp warning. She'd woken in the maternity ward, her lower abdomen pulsing with pain, and a stern nurse explaining that her body was in preterm distress. The twins were safe, for now, but rest was no longer optional. For the first time, she was ordered to stop. But the command felt more like a death sentence than a reprieve, because rest wasn't a luxury she could afford when survival required momentum. She stared at the ceiling, trying to count the holes in the tiles to quiet her mind. but numbers blurred with memories, and her thoughts kept drifting to the spreadsheet waiting unfinished on her laptop. Rent, tuition, food, it was all a delicate balance that didn't account for hospitalization. The hum of monitors and nurses' footsteps faded into background noise until a soft knock broke through the haze. Dr. Miriam Lang stepped into the room like a gust of clarity, tall, commanding, and known on campus as both terrifying and brilliant. Her presence in a student's hospital room was unheard of, and Penelope immediately tried to sit up, but her body protested with a sharp, warning jolt. Dr. Lang didn't smile. She rarely did, but there was a strange softness in her eyes as she pulled up a chair and sat without a word. In her hand was a worn leather folder. Penelope recognized it instantly. It held her preliminary notes on the hybrid ion propulsion concept she'd been developing in stolen hours between work and contractions. She'd never submitted it officially. It wasn't ready, not even close. But she'd shared the rough draft with Dr. Lang during a desperate late-night office visit weeks ago, hoping for a nod of approval or at least a suggestion for improvement. She never expected the woman to actually keep it. Without preamble, Dr. Lang opened the folder and said, "This model, where did you get it?" Penelope blinked, unsure if she was hallucinating. "I built it," she whispered. "From scratch, based on modified Hall effect variables, layered with magnetic field redirection." The professor tapped a page with her pen, lips pursed in thought. "This shouldn't work," she murmured, "but your math says it does." Penelope's heart thudded unevenly. "It's untested. The prototype's incomplete. I was going to shelve it until after everything." Her hand drifted to her belly, where two lives pressed forward with every movement. Dr. Lang raised an eyebrow. "Don't." One word. Simple. Final. She placed the folder on the tray table and leaned in. "There's a submission deadline for the NASA MIT Propulsion Challenge in 4 weeks. This," she tapped the page again, "is more than a project. This is innovation. I can sponsor your entry. But I won't coddle you. You do the math. You write the code. You prove it works. From that bed, if you have to." Penelope stared at her, disbelief bleeding into determination. "You think I have a shot?" she asked. The professor didn't answer with words, only stood and gave a single nod before walking out, leaving a universe of possibility in her wake. And just like that, Penelope's mind ignited. Lying in that hospital bed, tethered by monitors and IVs, she began to build. Not with tools or wires or access to a lab, but with equations scrawled across notepads, diagrams etched into paper lunch trays, and simulation code typed one-handed between contractions. Nurses joked that her room looked more like a war bunker than a maternity suite, but they learned not to move her things and not to silence her 3 a.m. brainstorming voice notes. She worked through every moment of wakefulness, her brain firing even as her body demanded sleep. Her friends, few as they were, delivered textbooks and printouts. Dr. Lang sent encrypted test modules and experimental datasets from MIT, sometimes annotated with sharp red questions like, "What's your thermal efficiency margin?" or "Run again with payload doubled." It was more pressure than she had ever felt in her life, but for the first time since Kieran's betrayal, she felt powerful again. Not in the way that came from validation or praise, but from creation. She was building something from nothing, just like she was doing with her children. And unlike the love she had once given freely and been burned for, this work would not betray her. It would endure. Some days she cried quietly between calculations, overcome by fear. Fear that she was chasing something impossible. Fear that she wouldn't finish in time. Fear that she was gambling too much on a dream that might never hatch. But then the twins would shift beneath her skin, and she'd place her hand on her stomach and remember who she was doing this for. Not for glory, not for a title, for them. So that one day they would know their mother didn't just survive, she fought with every breath, every neuron, every beat of her cracked but defiant heart. On the final day of submission, her hands shook as she hit send. The propulsion model was complete, the presentation simulation recorded, and her algorithms had run clean 3 times in a row. Whether she won or lost didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was that she had reclaimed something she thought she'd lost forever: her fire. A nurse walked in just as she leaned back, eyes wet but smiling. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" the nurse asked gently. Penelope looked out the window at the fading light, voice steady for the first time in weeks. "It will be." Because in the ashes of everything she had lost, her relationship, her stability, her sense of safety, Penelope Carter had lit a spark, and it was only beginning to burn. Penelope Carter had always known her body was strong, but she hadn't realized until that morning just how violently it could turn against her. The contractions started before dawn, low and rhythmic, like a distant drumbeat moving steadily closer. At first, she thought they were just the usual Braxton Hicks flares, the false alarms she'd grown used to dismissing with water and deep breathing. But this was different. The pain sharpened with every pulse, and by the time her breakfast tray arrived, her breath was hitching between clenched teeth. The nurse took one look at her face and hit the emergency call button. Within minutes, her room swarmed with motion, gloved hands, hushed voices, and the clipped rhythm of machines registering that her twins were coming early, much earlier than anyone had planned. The delivery room was a blur of white light and urgency. Penelope clutched the rails of the bed as the anesthesiologist prepared for an emergency C-section. Through the haze of pain and medication, she heard phrases like fetal distress and underdeveloped lungs. But her focus narrowed to one thing: they had to survive. She didn't care about deadlines or propulsion codes or the NASA competition. Nothing mattered now except those two small lives she hadn't even seen yet. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the mask covered her face, and the cold of the surgical table gripped her spine. Just before the anesthesia pulled her under, she whispered to herself, not as a prayer, but as a promise: "Don't let go." She woke hours later in a recovery room that smelled like antiseptic and fear. Her abdomen burned with post-surgical fire, and the nurse's soft voice barely registered as she explained that the twins were in the NICU. Tiny, fragile, but breathing. "Do you want to see them?" she asked. Penelope didn't respond right away. Her body felt hollow, like something essential had been removed and wasn't coming back. But then she nodded, and they wheeled her into the neonatal ward, past rows of incubators and blinking monitors. Her heart stuttered when she saw them. Two impossibly small babies, skin like silk, chests rising and falling beneath tubes and wires. A nurse whispered their weights, barely 3 pounds each. But to Penelope, they were massive. They were everything. She named them Asher and Elias, names that meant happy and Yahweh is salvation. Not because she was particularly religious, but because names like futures held power. She pressed her palm gently against the glass of their incubators, overwhelmed not by their fragility, but by the sheer will it must have taken for them to arrive screaming into a world that hadn't been ready for them. For the first time since Kieran's departure, she wept without shame. Not because she was scared, but because they had made it, and somehow so had she. And that victory, quiet and raw, was the kind no one could take from her. Days in the NICU blurred into nights filled with pump sessions, medical updates, and whispered lullabies through plastic barriers. Penelope rarely left the hospital, except to meet with Dr. Lang or check in with the NASA competition team remotely. Her body moved more slowly now, stitched and healing, but her mind remained sharp. She edited code between feedings, revised presentations while holding Elias skin to skin, and responded to technical feedback on the propulsion model with one hand on her laptop and the other stroking Asher's tiny back. Nurses began calling her the scientist mama, and doctors learned quickly that she understood oxygen saturation levels and velocity graphs with equal fluency. One afternoon, a man in a navy blazer and polished shoes entered the NICU waiting room. He introduced himself as a NASA director, sent by the competition board to meet her in person. Penelope, in sweats and with her hair in a frizzy bun, didn't flinch. She stood, offered her hand, and looked him straight in the eye. He didn't mention her appearance or her setting, just held up a folder with an embossed seal and said, "You didn't just win, Ms. Carter. You redefined the problem." She stared at the words on the letter he handed her, rereading them twice before believing they were real. She had won, She had won. The prize was more than recognition. It came with a full PhD scholarship, a spot on NASA's propulsion development team, and the option to license her design for future lunar missions. Penelope wanted to laugh, scream, cry, and collapse all at once, but instead she sat slowly in the vinyl chair, heart racing with a different kind of shock this time. The kind that comes not from being crushed, but from finally seeing the light after digging through miles of rock with bare hands. The man asked if she wanted to accept the position immediately or delay for maternity leave, and she simply replied, "I'm already working. Just tell me where to send the next schematic." That night, she sat between the twins' incubators and told them everything. Not the parts about heartbreak or betrayal, those were details for another time, but the parts about resilience and fire, about how they had shown up early, just like their mother always did, and how their fight had given her the strength to finish what she started. She whispered to them how they were born during the storm, not after, and that one day they'd see the stars their mother helped reach. The hospital staff hosted a small celebration the next day. Nothing fancy, just cupcakes and a plastic congratulations banner, but to Penelope, it was more than enough. She looked around at the nurses, the tired students who had helped her run simulations, the gruff janitor who had snuck her snacks during night shifts, and even Dr. Lang, who stood in the corner, arms folded, proud in the only way she knew how. Penelope raised her paper cup of ginger ale and said, "To all of you, thank you, and to my sons, this victory belongs to them." Because while the world would later say she rose from the ashes, Penelope Carter knew the truth. She hadn't risen, she had built from within the fire, and she had done it with two hearts beating inside her and a brilliance no one had seen coming. The world didn't notice Penelope Carter at first. In an industry built on old money, old names, and older expectations, a young black woman with premature twins and a background devoid of legacy didn't stir much attention. She wasn't flashy, didn't chase headlines, and declined every interview that offered to highlight her triumph as a single mother. Instead, she stayed silent and strategic, letting her work carve the path. While others spoke at conferences and collected awards, Penelope built quietly, ruthlessly, and with a precision that made competitors underestimate her until it was far too late. Nova Thrust Systems was born in a one-room lab at the edge of a neglected aerospace park, wedged between a disused weather satellite facility and a failing drone startup. It had no lobby, no receptionist, and no publicists. It had a whiteboard filled with quantum equations, 3 unpaid interns who'd follow her into fire, and a folding crib next to the server rack. Her sons, Asher and Elias, learned to walk between fusion battery prototypes and read blueprints before they knew how to tie their shoes. They didn't grow up with cartoons, they grew up with rocket launches playing on loop and lullabies whispered under the low hum of 3D printers. Funding didn't come easily. Investors smiled politely during her pitches, but their eyes often slid past her, as if waiting for a male co-founder to walk in. More than once, she was asked if she was assisting the lead engineer or managing HR. But Penelope had long since learned that rejection was just data, that every closed door simply pointed toward one she had to build herself. So she bootstrapped, reinvested every dollar, coded her own patents, and filed them under an LLC no one had heard of until it started filing for aerospace contracts and winning. By the time Nova Thrust closed its 5th Department of Defense deal, the same investors who had ignored her came crawling back. But she didn't take their money. She didn't need it anymore. As her empire expanded, so did the whispers. Who was this woman disrupting propulsion systems once thought impossible to optimize? How had a mother of 2 cracked the re-entry equation that had stumped MIT's brightest for decades? No one could trace her success to nepotism or institutional handholding. Everything she had built was born of sleepless nights, hospital corridors, and the hollow ache left by betrayal. She channeled that pain not into vengeance, but into algorithms and fuel efficiency, into stealth tech and lunar transport design, into a fortress of innovation with her name etched into every wall. She never spoke of Kieran Whitmore, not in interviews, not in lectures, not even in private, but his absence was woven into every decision she made. While Whitmore Dynamics, once the crown jewel of commercial aerospace, hemorrhaged relevance with each fiscal quarter, Nova Thrust soared. Where his board shuffled executives like cards, her leadership team remained fiercely loyal. She offered maternity leave longer than any federal requirement, paid for night classes for single parents on her staff, and donated anonymously to domestic violence shelters. She never bragged, never sought applause. Her impact spoke louder than her presence ever did. The first time Penelope saw Kieran's name again was on a leaked article forecasting Whitmore Dynamics' impending bankruptcy. Their prototype for a Mars-bound cargo hauler had failed testing catastrophically, and investor confidence plummeted. Kieran, now CEO, gave a televised statement claiming the issue was under control, but his eyes lacked the sharpness she remembered. His voice, once arrogant and crisp, now trembled beneath rehearsed optimism. He looked like a man clawing at the remains of a throne he'd assumed was his by birthright. Penelope didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She simply closed her laptop and called her boardroom. The acquisition took 3 weeks. Swift, clean, surgical. Nova Thrust moved quietly, using a proxy firm to buy majority shares, then announced its ownership in a press release that shook the aerospace world. The final line of the statement read, Nova Thrust Systems welcomes Whitmore Dynamics into its portfolio of legacy re-engineering projects. The phrasing was deliberate. Legacy re-engineering, not preservation, not a partnership. Reinvention. The night the news broke, Penelope stood on the balcony of her office, overlooking the city skyline. The twins were at home, working on a mock satellite model for a school project, and the lab was quiet except for the distant hum of simulations running. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt whole. The empire she had built wasn't a monument to revenge. It was a sanctuary born from being abandoned. A living testament that the woman once told she was dead weight had become the very gravity others now orbited. She didn't call Kieran. She didn't need to, because the next time they crossed paths, it wouldn't be on her knees begging for acknowledgement. It would be on a stage with cameras flashing and reporters asking how it felt to acquire the company that once symbolized his family's legacy. And on that day, she would wear the same navy dress he once loved and say nothing at all, because silence, when delivered from the top, is louder than any insult hurled from below. Penelope Carter had not just survived betrayal. She had engineered it. She had taken its weight and built a kingdom so structurally sound, no man could collapse it again. And in that kingdom, her sons slept peacefully, their mother's name written in the stars. The ballroom shimmered with opulence, crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen fireworks, orchestral music laced with wealth, and industry titans sipping champagne as if their glasses held liquid power. It was the kind of night built for legacy, where cameras flashed for old money and polished last names, and innovation came wrapped in black tuxedos and silver evening gowns. But when Penelope Carter stepped through the doors, dressed in a floor-length graphite gown that shimmered like heat off a rocket's hull, the entire room shifted. Conversations faltered mid-sentence, eyes widened behind designer lenses, and whispers chased her across the marble floor. She didn't walk like someone attending a gala. She walked like someone who had built the gala and decided to let the guests stay. Her sons, now 15 and nearly as tall as she was, flanked her in tailored suits that somehow made them look both youthful and formidable. Asher held her hand without hesitation, while Elias moved with the cool confidence of a child who had never known what it felt like to be underestimated. They didn't smile for the cameras, didn't fidget under the flashing lights. They had grown up inside the belly of brilliance, and tonight was just another orbit. They belonged here, not because of a name passed down from a dynasty, but because they carried a legacy forged in silence, steel, and stubbornness. Penelope didn't need to announce the purpose of her presence. The agenda had already gone viral hours before. Nova Thrust Systems had finalized its acquisition of Whitmore Dynamics. The once mighty empire that Kieran's father had built, that Kieran had slowly dismantled through ego and denial, now belonged entirely to the woman he once discarded like an inconvenience. There was no scandal, no litigation, no contest, just a clean public transfer of power from one name to another. On the screen above the ballroom stage, the new logo glowed. Nova Thrust, Gakachar, Whitmore Division, smaller font, smaller presence. a footnote beneath her monolith. She stood near the center of the room when she felt it. A silence that came not from reverence but from recognition. Kieran had arrived. She turned slowly, not because she needed the moment, but because she knew he did. He stood by the entrance in a suit that no longer carried the weight it used to, his once coiffed hair now slightly disheveled, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on her. There was no arrogance left in his expression, only disbelief tinged with something quieter. Regret, maybe, though far too late to matter. He walked toward her with the hesitant steps of a man approaching a reckoning he couldn't outrun. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. His gaze flicked to the boys, who stared back with measured disinterest. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, like the words he'd prepared had evaporated beneath her stare. Finally, he said almost softly, "I didn't know it was you." Penelope didn't blink. "That's the problem, Kieran. You never bothered to look closely." He swallowed, his throat visibly tightening. "I came to congratulate you. And I wanted to see them. Just once." Asher tilted his head, studying the man who had given them nothing but DNA and distance. Elias stepped forward a fraction, voice calm but cutting. "You mean the children you called a burden before they could even breathe?" Kieran flinched, as if the boy's words were blades, but he didn't deny them. "I was stupid," he said finally. "Young, scared. I thought I had everything figured out. I was wrong." Penelope raised an eyebrow, her voice even. "You thought you had options. That's not the same as being scared." He looked at her then, not with lust, not with pity, but with something almost human. "I've watched everything you've done, from the sidelines. I had no idea you were capable of this." She smiled, not warmly, but like someone acknowledging an old truth. "That's because you were too busy measuring me against your limitations. You mistook quiet for weakness. That mistake cost you everything." The room around them pulsed with attention, but she didn't care. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about closing a door that had been left ajar for too long. Kieran turned to his sons, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to see who you became," Elias answered, tone firm. "We became everything you walked away from. And more." Asher added, not with malice, but with finality. Kieran nodded slowly, something in him folding inward. Then he stepped back, looked at Penelope one last time and said, "I guess this was never my story to begin with." She didn't respond. He turned and disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by the very world he once ruled. And this time, no one followed him. After he left, Penelope exhaled. Not relief, not triumph, but peace. The kind of peace that comes not from erasing the past, but from outgrowing it. She turned to her sons, touched each of their shoulders and said, "Let's go home." And together they walked past reporters, past executives, past ghosts of everything that might have been, toward the future they had already begun to build, one that needed no apology to validate its worth. The launch pad shimmered beneath a pale gold sky, stretching across the high desert like a cathedral of ambition. Reporters lined the perimeter, security drones hummed above, and scientists in dark flight suits moved with silent precision as countdown monitors blinked across the observation center. But none of them commanded attention the way Penelope Carter did as she stepped forward, her figure cast in silhouette against the towering body of the Nova 1 lunar relay vessel, the first of its kind, the first of her kind. She wasn't holding a mic, wasn't giving a press briefing, and yet every camera in the world was trained on her. Not because she demanded to be seen, but because she had become impossible to ignore. Asher and Elias stood on either side of her, now young men with eyes that carried both wonder and certainty. They weren't simply attendees of this historic launch. They were contributors, engineers of their merit, armed with code and calculations that had passed through NASA's toughest scrutiny. Their mother had given them the blueprint for resilience, but they had constructed their brilliance. They didn't wear her shadow. They walked beside it, proud of the lineage that bore no dynasty, only fire and grit. In the VIP gallery behind mirrored glass, a man watched with shoulders slightly slumped and jaw tight. Kieran Whitmore had received his invitation like everyone else, sent with courtesy, no emotion, just protocol. He hadn't expected it, hadn't earned it, but still, he came. He came not to be seen, but to witness. He wore a suit that fit looser than before, carried no entourage, and when he looked at the vessel now bearing his family name as a subsidiary label, it was not with entitlement, but with a haunting sense of what he'd thrown away. No one acknowledged him, not the journalists, not the board members, not even the former colleagues who had once chased his approval. He wasn't a villain, not exactly, just irrelevant, a ghost of a collapsed dynasty watching a new world rise without him. He didn't speak when Penelope appeared on the screen above, offering a brief address not of dominance, but of vision. Her voice was steady, her words surgical. She spoke of the future, of lunar data networks, of autonomous orbital chains, but never once of vengeance. She didn't need to. The vessel behind her, the suns beside her, and the logo stamped boldly across the nose cone said everything her silence didn't. The countdown began. 10, 9. The ground trembled slightly. From the control room, Asher called out system checks while Elias monitored the velocity interface. Their faces were calm, focused, and the resemblance to their mother in those moments was unmistakable. Penelope stood just behind them, hands clasped, not with tension, but with quiet awe. She wasn't afraid of failure. She had faced greater odds with far less. This wasn't a test. It was a statement. 3, 2, 1. The rocket ignited with a roar that shook the windows and rippled across the sand like thunder. Flames licked the sky, smoke poured upward in a spiraling column, and the Nova Y lifted with stunning grace, climbing past gravity's pull and into legend. Cheers erupted across the facility, screens flashed telemetry success, and inside the control room, Penelope smiled. Not wide, not flashy, just enough to betray the pride she rarely let surface. Her sons turned to her, grinning, and she pulled them both into an embrace that said more than applause ever could. In the gallery, Kieran didn't clap. He didn't stand. He just sat there, small and silent, eyes following the ascending vessel until it vanished into the blue. No one asked him how it felt. No one offered him a statement, because this wasn't his moment. This was hers and had always been. Later that evening, the Nova Thrust campus was alive with celebration. Engineers toasted with sparkling cider, interns danced under projection domes of moon maps, and every screen in the building replayed the successful launch in a loop. Penelope didn't stay long at the party. She preferred the silence of her rooftop, where the stars were visible above the hum of machines she had helped bring into existence. Asher joined her first, carrying a tablet filled with data, already drafting optimization ideas for the next relay chain. Elias arrived moments later, asking if they could pitch a Mars comms link next quarter. She laughed, nodded, and leaned back against the rail, the cold air biting and beautiful. They stood together in the quiet, the kind of silence that feels earned, and Penelope thought of everything it had taken to get here. Not just years, but lives, dreams once discarded, betrayals that had tried to bury her, nights in sterile hospital rooms, spreadsheets scrawled by hand. Equations were built while two babies slept beside her on research papers stained with formula. She had turned all of it into fuel. She didn't need statues. She didn't need her name carved into marble, because the world now ran on systems she had conceived, innovations she had willed into being. Her legacy wasn't waiting to be written. It was already orbiting Earth. Back inside the building, her name flashed on a digital banner above the atrium. Penelope Carter, visionary, founder, mother, architect of tomorrow. But she didn't stop to read it. Instead, she walked with her sons toward the lab once more. Because legends, unlike empires, don't fall. They evolve. And behind them, somewhere in the distance, a man once called Kieran stood in the shadows, watching not just what she had built, but what he could never touch again. The end of his story had already been written. Hers, however, had only just begun. And that is the story of how a woman once called a burden became the architect of a new era. What did you feel during this journey? Did Penelope's rise inspire you, break your heart, or set your soul on fire? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if you want more stories that hit hard, heal deep, and remind you what resilience looks like, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a moment with us. Thank you for staying till the end. We see you. We appreciate you. Until next time, stay bold, stay curious, and never let anyone define your worth.